The Crimean Peninsula has been shaken by the attacks of unmanned aerial vehicles and surface drones in recent days. This critical airstrike targeted the Crimean city of Sevastopol. Since this is the main port of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, drone and surface drone attacks in Sevastopol have caused a serious impact in Moscow and undue alarm among the residents of Crimea after these striking attacks. The last straw in Crimea was the explosions on the Kerch Bridge. After the explosions on the bridge, a state of emergency was declared in Crimea. The head of Crimea, appointed by Russia, Sergei Aksyonov, reported that emergency response teams and law enforcement officers were dispatched to the scene. Aksyonov urged residents of the peninsula and those traveling to and from Crimea temporarily to choose an alternative land route. But the residents of Crimea and the tourists on the peninsula were already alarmed. Tens of thousands of people took action to flee from Crimea. Thousands of peninsula residents and tourists hurriedly leave Crimea after stopping traffic on the Kerch Bridge, which was damaged in an alleged attack by a Ukrainian surface plane. Russian tourists and peninsula residents flocked to the Konar Bridge to escape the occupied Crimea after the Kerch Bridge was blown up. Massive traffic jams are forming at accessible exits from Crimea as authorities assess the timing of the bridge's restoration and offer drivers to use the ferry crossing. There were too many carpools for transportation centers to cope with this heavy traffic, according to the News of RIA Novosti. Vehicle traffic leaving Crimea in the direction of Melitopol in the Kherson region annexed by Russia has extended by 5 kilometers. The traffic jam on the E105 highway starts from Sokolovsky Lake, about 20 kilometers from the Chongar Bridge, according to the National Hospitality Industry Association. There are currently at least 50,000 tourists on the peninsula, most of whom arrived by private vehicles to combat traffic congestion. Cars in the occupied areas are preparing to pass through checkpoints with almost no documentation, even if the bridge leading to Crimea did not explode at night. Clinical death was experienced on the peninsula during the tourist season, but the explosions at the Kerch Bridge certainly increased the number of people fleeing the Crimea. Repeatedly targeting bridge and ship traffic from Russia to Crimea limits Russia's ability to resupply its military forces there and may even help Russia loosen its grip on Crimea. This is to the benefit of Ukraine as well as by preventing attacks on the rest of Ukraine centered on Crimea. The bridge is a critical artery in terms of meeting both the daily needs of Crimea and the supplies of the army, as well as the fuel and supplies of civilians. The Russian-backed official of the peninsula, Elena Lekshin, states that Crimea is well supplied with fuel, food, and industrial goods. Denis Pushilin, the Russian-backed president of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, announced that he had met with his Crimean counterpart to take measures to ensure faster passage through the administrative border checkpoints. Pushilin announced that the night curfew has been suspended to allow 24-hour travel to Crimea and is working to ensure fuel is available at gas stations along the route. But ultimately, it looks like the Russian army in Crimea will now run out of supplies and slowly face a crisis. The only supply route to Crimea is through the currently occupied southern Ukraine. Local partisans are raising hell on the Chongar side. This area is increasingly being taken under artillery protection by the Ukrainian army. The deadly attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge intensified criticism of Russia's military leadership, which was already dealing with internal strife. But the Russians are trying to reduce the tension in this regard and to relieve the residents of the peninsula a little more. Two-way traffic on the bridge will only be open for one lane until September 15th, according to a televised remote meeting with officials including Putin. Two-way traffic on both lanes will then be opened on November 1st. Hours after the attack, Moscow announced its withdrawal from the Black Sea grain deal, a deal that helps keep global food prices stable. However, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov reported that during the crossing the Kerch Strait Bridge and Russia's decision to stop participating in the agreement are not linked. So the Kremlin refuses to extend the Black Sea grain agreement, even though it doesn't want to be clear about the reasons stopping the export of Ukrainian grain to the rest of the world. United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres expressed his deep disappointment, saying Russia's withdrawal from the grain deal was a lifeline for global food security because the grain deal helped lower food prices globally by more than 20%. On the other hand, Russian President Vladimir Putin blamed Ukraine for the early morning attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge, which connects Crimea to the south of Russia. Putin announced that the Ministry of Defense has prepared Russia's response while the Security Police, FSB, will investigate the attack. While Mr. Putin has promised revenge, the attack has sparked harsh comments from some military bloggers who generally support the war and are harshly critical of the way it's prosecuted. Yuri Podolyak, a well-known blogger on the Telegram messaging app who has nearly 3 million followers, stated that it's a fact that Russia did nothing to protect this connection road after the explosion of the explosive-laden truck on the bridge. Igor Girkin, a former Russian intelligence officer who runs a prominent military blog, has warned that Ukraine will attack repeatedly until the link is broken. On the other hand, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev did not know what to say out of anger. Hours after the alleged attack on Crimea's Kerch Bridge, which Moscow blames on Kiev, since the start of the war in Ukraine, Medvedev has become famous for making threats to the West using his Telegram channel. But it's unclear to what extent his views reflect that of the Kremlin. Medvedev did not mislead us in this regard and, in succumbing to his anger, blamed the Ukrainians. Kiev, on the other hand, generally does not take responsibility for attacks on Crimea or Russian territory. Ukrainian officials celebrated the recent attack on the Kerch Bridge, but maintained their policy of strategic uncertainty and avoided commenting on Ukraine's possible roles. However, Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov, stated that drones from his country were behind the early morning explosions. Ukrainian officials had previously said that the bridge was a legitimate target because of its vital logistical role in the Kremlin's war effort. It was only in May that the head of Ukraine's security service admitted for the first time that his forces were involved in the October offensive. Mikhailo Podolyak, a senior advisor to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, said illegal structures used to deliver Russian vehicles of mass murder are necessarily short-lived. Whatever the causes of destruction, Anton Gerashchenko, advisor to the Ukrainian Interior Minister on this issue, said trucks will pass by land through occupied areas that are constantly bombed. According to Deputy Prime Minister Marit Kusnulin, one section of the bridge was destroyed and the other was displaced by more than 80 centimeters or 30 in. But the main support pillars remained intact. This was what Mr. Putin called good news. Mr. Kusnulin reported that a lane of traffic was restored late on Monday. He stated that the less damaged lanes on the bridge will be restored by mid-September and will initially be used for traffic in both directions, with the rest of the lanes to be opened by November. Video and photos showed that the bridge was damaged on both highways, most notably on the side used for Russian traffic. One photograph showed a damaged car on the bridge. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, on the other hand, is based in Crimea, which is also a popular summer tourist destination. During the height of beach season, at least some traffic will be diverted from areas of southern Ukraine newly occupied by Russia. A journey of about 600 kilometers or 375 miles apart from the bridge's train lines. This route is the only major land route left along Ukraine's southern coast to support Russia's tens of thousands of soldiers fighting in the country. The railway bridge was opened to freight trains 3 years ago. Since then, it's played a key role in strengthening the military capabilities of the Russian army on the Crimean Peninsula. More recently, since Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, its military has rallied on the Kerch Bridge to transport its troops and weapons systems into southern Ukraine. The attacks on the Kerch Bridge are expected to increase as the Ukrainian counter-offensive approaches Crimea. The Ukrainians have shown that they have the ability to hit strategic targets with both special operations teams and unmanned aerial vehicles. The battle that is currently taking place between Russia and Ukraine has reached a crucial stage, particularly in these recent days. Large-scale offensive operations planned and carried out by the Ukrainians on the southern front lines, particularly in Zaporizhia as well as in the Donbass region, have now entered Russian territory. Consequently, Russia is now the exclusive theater of conflict. It was even asserted that the Ukrainian armed forces had intentions to invade the capital city of Moscow at some point during the conflict, because as of right now, the nation's capital, Moscow, has been turned into a raging inferno as a direct result of attacks carried out by unmanned aerial vehicles. A recent strike on the territory of the Moscow region reportedly involved 5 unmanned aerial vehicles, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Astonishing videos of the massive explosions were also shared on social media by locals from 5 different residential districts. Let's take a look together at some of the most shocking moments of the drone assaults that were carried out in Moscow, the capital of Russia. The Vnukovo Air Base near Moscow will be our first destination. This location is home to a significant military installation and logistics hub for Russia to begin. The city of Moscow was rocked when the news of the explosion at the Vnukovo airport was announced. An enormous explosion took place at the Vnukovo Air Base in Moscow, which is located in the very center of Russia. Unmanned aerial vehicles were identified as the source of the explosions. According to the announcement, it was stated by the Bassa Telegram channel that the unmanned aerial vehicles were a form of aircraft and that they were flying at an altitude of 200 meters over. The drones had struck the Vnukovo airbase. A significant explosion occurred, which was followed by the outbreak of a fire that was difficult to put out for a considerable amount of time. According to reports in the Russian media, some of the flights were rerouted from Vnukovo Airport to Sheremetyevo Airport. In addition to this, the eruptions that began in Vnukovo spread to the surrounding regions of Volovo, Kabinka, Akishino, Maraschino, and Kaluga. At first, people living in Volyevo, which is close to Moscow, were the ones who reported hearing explosions in Vnukovo. Residents of Volyevo are said to have heard the noises of Russian air defense, which was followed by the appearance of columns of black smoke in the sky. Nonetheless, residents of the Valuver neighborhood reported hearing loud explosions there as well. The citizens of Volyevo lived in constant fear that the explosions that occurred in Vnukovo might spread to their town. Residents in Maraschino, on the other hand, have also reported hearing the explosion at the Vnukovo airbase. Residents in Maraschino, Russia reported feeling very anxious as a result of the black smoke and explosions. They said that the smoke originated from the Vnukovo airport where they were. On the other hand, it was reported that there were violent explosions in the Maraschino district and that security measures are currently being conducted in this settlement. According to reports in Russian media, the deployment of the air defense systems resulted in the destruction of a total of 2 unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. One of the unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs that was used in the assaults near Moscow was responsible for hanging the Russian military unit in Kabinka. According to the information, Moscow officials provided very little information regarding the blasts that took place at the Kabinka air base following the explosion that occurred at the headquarters of the Kabinka military unit. The Russian authorities immediately severed all connections that the media had with this region. Residents of Kabinka were very alarmed about the large amount of black smoke that accumulated in the skies over this military installation, despite the fact that few details were released about the incident in close proximity to Vnukovo Airport. The Akishino community reported hearing word of a remarkable explosion. Images of the explosions that occurred here were also shared on various social media platforms. Local residents are highly restless because there is reason to be concerned about the possibility of many explosions occurring within the town. In a nutshell, the explosions made for a very long day in Moscow, and for the people who live in the area surrounding the city at the moment, security measures are in effect in 5 local ones close to Moscow. The political repercussions of the explosions that occurred close to Moscow infuriated Russian civilians, in addition to the impact that the blasts had on their bodies. As of right now, not only is the situation in Moscow and other significant cities in Russia, including Rostov, still precarious as a result of the Wagner insurrection, but the voice of Russian residents against the government has been amplified as a result of the explosions that have just taken place in Moscow. There were resounding demonstrations against the administration of Vladimir Putin. The critical explosions that occurred close to Moscow significantly lowered people's faith in the administration of the Kremlin, as well as in Russian President Vladimir Putin. This was due to the fact that any location, including the nation's capital of Moscow, could be attacked if so desired. Officials in Moscow had officially stated before to the occurrence of these strikes that the capital city was secured by a significantly increased number of air defense systems. Electronic warfare equipment were reportedly installed on the rooftops of high-rise buildings in both Moscow and St. Petersburg, as was reported in the news. Nevertheless, it would appear that the actions made by the Russians were insufficient in this regard. According to a large number of political and military officials, the Ukrainian army was responsible for carrying out these striking attacks in the vicinity of Moscow, despite the fact that the Russian authorities pointed the finger at Kiev for the 5 drone assaults that took place in Moscow. The Ukrainian authorities have not provided any explanation on this matter, although the government in Kiev did not publicly admit responsibility for the attacks. Numerous international intelligence sources and authorities in Moscow are in agreement that Ukrainians were the ones who carried them out. The mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, provided his observations and opinions regarding the drone strike. Sergei Sobyanin asserted that the unmanned aerial vehicles UAVs originated from within the borders of Ukraine. On the other hand, there is no evidence that can be considered conclusive. There is a lack of clarity regarding the route that the UAVs took to get in Moscow. In point of fact, the Ukrainian armed forces had previously been successful in launching drone assaults and partisan operations against a number of places in Russia, including the capital city of Moscow, in particular, the Belgorod region, which is located on the western border of Russia with Ukraine, has been the target of hundreds of bombings as well as drone attacks. In point of fact, a war correspondent named Yuri Kostyuk, who covered the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, recently remarked on his Telegram channel that the Ukrainian army had transformed Russia's border regions into a deadly combat zone. In addition to these regions, the city of Belgorod is of particular significance on the Russian side of the border with Ukraine. It was one of the liveliest cities there. However, as a result of the drone assaults that were carried out by the Ukrainian government on this city, Belgorod was entirely turned on its head, and there were absolutely no signs of life remaining in the city. The people who live in the Belgorod region have had it up to their eyeballs with the aggressive military measures that the Russian government is pursuing in Ukraine, mainly due to the fact that residents of this city no longer wish to feel the effects of the conflict in their own homes. On the other hand, the incident that took place in Belgorod was an act of sabotage carried out by a partisan organization known as the Freedom Legion for Russia. When the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Russian Freedom Legion attempted to cross the border in March and again at the end of May, they were met with resistance by Russian border guards and regular army soldiers. After that, the Russian Freedom Legion made an attempt to seize control of the 40,000-person city of Shebekino as the district governor ordered inhabitants to temporarily evacuate the area. Shelling, blackouts, fires, and the terrified flight of thousands were just some of the dangers that almost a dozen towns and farms in and around the city faced. The administration in Kiev did not issue a statement regarding the raids that took place in Belgorod and Shebekino. According to the reports of specialists, all of these attacks were merely a warning shot, and in the next days, larger attacks would hit other cities. In Russia, the predictions made by experts were validated by the drone assaults that took place in Moscow. However, some experts in the field of military analysis claimed that these drone attacks close to Moscow are not the true significant attacks that the Ukrainian armed forces have planned. In other words, in the next days, Russia may be subjected to new attacks that are significantly larger and more severe than any of the offensive operations that we have described so far. Putin is in a very powerless position about this topic because the Russian leader does not yet have control of the conflict that is taking place on Ukrainian territory. Now that Russia is also being attacked, Putin is in a precarious position, to say the least. If the leader of Russia decides to move his defense measures to these locations in order to avoid drone, missile, and sabotage assaults in his country, then the Russian troops currently stationed on the territory of Ukraine will be lacking in this regard, both in terms of their military resources and their morale and motivation. The Russian forces that are presently fighting in Ukraine have completely broken down. In conclusion, Vladimir Putin and the people of Russia gained nothing positive from their country's involvement in the conflict in Ukraine. On the other hand, this conflict returned Russia back to the time when it was part of the Soviet Union. In the city of Belgorod, close to the Ukrainian border, anti-Kremlin rebels assert that they have taken a sizable number of Russian soldiers. The city's governor had been invited to meet with rebel groups hostile to Vladimir Putin's government so that they might deliver the inmates and conduct negotiations. The Ukrainian army reached the bottom of the Crimea. Now the green light is on for airstrikes on the island. In recent weeks, the Ukrainian armed forces have made significant gains towards the Malachna port. If they achieve their goal, most of the territory captured by the Russian army will be returned to Ukraine. When this was the case, great arguments broke out among Kremlin officials. The number of Russian politicians opposing Putin has increased. On the other hand, the Russian administration announced that they would carry out severe attacks in case of an attack on Crimea. But Ukrainians are no longer afraid of anything. Military experts also noted that the counterattack by the Ukrainian forces was quite successful. In fact, experts explained that the success of the Ukrainian side is based on several factors. According to experts, the supply lines of the Russian army are about to collapse. Not only that, but experts also noted that Ukrainians get used to Western weapons quite easily. That's why while the Ukrainian army is fighting without any problems in the supply of weapons, the Russians are trying to solve the supply problem in every region. They will attack. The Ukrainians have now achieved quite significant achievements on the southern front. The sounds of clashes began to be heard near the Malachna port region just north of Crimea. If the Ukrainian armed forces can regain control of the region, an important supply route for Russian forces in the south will be cut off. Thus, the supply on the southern front of the Russian army will be completely cut off. If that happens, the Russian army will be compelled to seek new supply routes. The Russians in the south will also have to use their main supply lines in the Donbass region, which is quite difficult if the port of Melny falls. The Russian army will have to withdraw from all regions in the south of Ukraine and go to the Crimea. In addition, Ukrainian forces will be able to open a new line of communication with the besieged city of Mariupol. However, the Russian Federation does not remain silent on this situation. The Russian army responded to the advances of the Ukrainian forces with a series of airstrikes in Kherson Oblast. However, these airstrikes failed to stop the Ukrainian forces. Military experts consider that the Russian army is now in a difficult situation. If the Russian command continues to send troops into the war in the south, they will risk losing territory in other areas. However, if they decide to withdraw troops from the south, they will risk losing Kherson Oblast entirely. The outcome of the battle for control of Milan's port is still uncertain. However, the recent achievements of the Ukrainian armed forces show that they are in a position to recapture most of the territory captured by the Russian Federation. As the Ukrainian army advances south, Ukrainian artillery comes within range to hit the Crimea. At the moment, HIMARS systems and Ukrainian warplanes can hit the northernmost areas of Crimea. That's why the Kiev command gave the green light in a short time. We may hear news of a large number of explosions in the Crimea region. On the other hand, the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy began to hide its most important warship as the Ukrainians advanced into the Crimea. The Russian Navy began to retreat. The Russian Navy took a radical new decision to protect its most valuable warships against Ukrainian attacks. Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate has been painted in a new paint scheme that hides the Admiral Essence 751 battleship boundaries against the threat of the Ukrainian Navy's naval drones. The Russian Navy has started to apply a new deceptive camouflage scheme. This new paint developed will also try to mislead the drone operators' targets. However, it is not known exactly how well this new scheme will work. Admiral Grigorovich-class frigates play an important role in Russia's attacks on Ukraine. This warship, each of which can carry a caliber and attack missiles, has also carried out numerous attacks in the south of Ukraine. This warship is also the most capable warships in Russia's Black Sea Fleet and acts as the flagship. The Ukrainian threat of unmanned vessels still exists in the Sevastopol port. These small boats have a substantial warhead and are powerful enough to sink a warship. The new camouflage scheme of the Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate is a clear indication that the Russian Navy is adapting to the new realities of war. It also shows that the Navy is starting to take steps to protect its most valuable warships. This new paint scheme of the Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate resembles the camouflage scheme that Kriegsmarine applied to the battleship Bismarck during the Second World War. There was even a false nose wave and awakening to mislead the observer as to the size and therefore identity of the ship. It's not the first old-fashioned camouflage the Russian Navy has tried since the start of the war. In March last year, he started to paint the whole numbers of the ships in the Black Sea. This may seem old-fashioned to some observers, but is cited by military experts as a sensible precaution that makes identifying ships more difficult. In the ongoing war in the Donbass region of Ukraine, several of Russia's most powerful tanks, the TB were destroyed by the Ukrainian army in the Spern region. It was once again revealed that the Ukrainian army successfully defended the Russian attacks. The war in the Spern region shows that the Ukrainian army is successfully fighting even the most powerful military equipment of Russia. The Ukrainian army uses the latest technologies and tactics to counter Russian attacks. In this incident, the Ukrainian army managed to destroy the TB tanks of Russia. TB tanks are one of the most powerful tanks in Russia and pose a serious threat to the Ukrainian army. These tanks are frequently attacked on targets deep in Ukraine and are considered one of the most capable combat vehicles in Russia's Donbass region. However, the Ukrainian army is also successfully fighting against TB tanks. Ukrainian army uses quite different tactics against Russia's attacks. Thanks to this, the Ukrainian army manages to counter even the most powerful tanks of Russia. The success of the Ukrainian army is not only due to the use of military technology and tactics. At the same time, the Ukrainian army is able to successfully defend against Russian attacks due to factors such as military leadership, discipline, training, and motivation. The success of the Ukrainian army is not limited to the Spern region. The Ukrainian army continues to defend successfully in other parts of Russia in the Donbass region. The Ukrainian army is seriously prepared and resolutely fighting to counter the attacks of Russia. On the other hand, the Ukrainian side started airstrikes on the areas just north of Crimea. Governor Vladimir Saldo, appointed to Kherson by Russia, announced that the Ukrainian army had hit the road bridge connecting Crimea to Kherson region. Governor Vladimir Saldo, appointed by Russia to the Kherson region, shared on his social media account that the Ukrainian army hit the Shanhar highway bridge connecting Crimea to Kherson with missiles, stating that the bridge was damaged. Saldo also explained that a large part of the bridge was damaged. Saldo noted that Ukraine may have used Storm Shadow missiles sent by the UK. According to the first determinations, the road bridge, which Russia calls the Crimea Gate, is known as the shortest route from Crimea to the southern front line. After the shooting of this bridge, it was revealed that the Russian army could not provide the necessary supply to the southern front. The Ukrainian army is now able to hit the Russian supply as well. As we mentioned at the beginning, the Ukrainian army may have launched a major operation against Crimea. At the moment, local sources also stated that the airstrikes of the Ukrainian army are only the beginning. Advancing to the critical port area, the Ukrainians have already broken the backbone of the Russians. It started in a great flurry in the Russian army. Intelligence sources also explained that Russian troops in the north of Crimea have started preparations to withdraw to safer areas. For this reason, the great operation of the Crimea may have begun. We'll see what happens in the next few days. We have reached the end of another video. You can support us by liking the video. You can easily follow new videos by subscribing. I wish you all a war-free day,